everybody. Welcome to this session about exposing REST services. We're going to try to do a soup to nuts walkthrough of building a REST service or building REST services, exposing them and securing them using Apex and ORS. Of course, with everything that we do, we need to put out the safe harbor. You know, basically what we're saying here is what we know and is true to everything that we understand. You shouldn't create or make buying decisions or purchases based on this, but we're going to do our best to give you the best information possible. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Doug Galt. I'm a consulting member of technical staff here at Oracle. I've been working with Oracle for a very long time and started with before the web was even a thing. So I've been doing this a long time. And I credit Application Express, HTMLDB as was kind of saving my career, because I was an old PL SQL and Forms developer and was really tired of kind of what I was doing. I either had to choose the management path or kind of switch over. And some of you on the call may remember that at one point I was actually trying to decide whether I wanted to give it up completely and go to Costa Rica and buy a hotel and just completely give up IT. But then I found HTMLDB, and my path has been set ever since. I joined Oracle in 2016 and originally joined the ORS team and then moved over to the Apex team. That's kind of why I am doing what I'm doing in terms of the REST services stuff, because I got involved in the ORS piece. I wrote the ORS REST service console for Apex and then have moved over and started doing some other stuff. I'm based in Fort Worth, Texas, and you can look me up there on Twitter. My email is there, and my blog is there as well. Okay, so today's agenda. There is a lot to cover. I was just talking with David and Joel, and I could write a whole 5-day class on exposing and then consuming REST services, and that's not a lie. There's enough to see out there and understand that you could spend an entire week and to do a deep dive on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to hit the high points and then just show you what really you can do with this. So we're going to do a very brief overview of what REST is, a very brief history of REST in terms of Apex and ORS, a very high-level view of what ORS provides in terms of APIs and views and that kind of stuff. And then we're going to get to the nitty-gritty and just kind of do it. We're going to create a RESTful service on emp and dept. We're going to secure those services, and we're going to consume them using PL SQL, or we're going to show you the very basics of consuming them in PL SQL. Hopefully, there will be time for questions. Like I said, there's a lot to get going on with here, so let's get going. First, a very brief overview of what is REST. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's basically an architecture that allows two computers to talk to each other using HTTP. And most of the time, the data is transferred back and forth between those two systems using JSON, sometimes XML, but mostly a JSON format, which is basically a textual format that is kind of an object notation. The great thing about REST is that the two participants in that, the caller and the exposer, or the caller and the provider, don't have to have really anything in common except the ability to talk over HTTP. They can be using different languages, different databases underneath the covers, different architectures. One can be in the cloud, the other can be on premise. It can be completely disparate systems. It really doesn't matter. The main tenet being that the service being called must be reachable by the caller via HTTP, and that's really it. And there's an underlying kind of key in there, especially when you're talking about databases, because obviously calling out from your database, especially from 11G and forward, means that you have to have access control lists and wallets and all kinds of stuff for security. We'll talk about some of that a little bit later. So more or less, REST allows computers to talk to each other. A request response, very much, because it's over HTTP, it's just like an HTML page. Someone sends a request, they get a response back, and that's it. REST communicates over HTTP, therefore it uses the standard HTTP methods. What's interesting about this is that they kind of relate to what you're used to in SQL. A GET looks up information from the service, so that's a select. A PUT does mutation of data, so that's an update. A POST creates new data, that's an insert. And the delete is pretty self-explanatory. For more in-depth information on what REST is, how it was defined, why it was defined, the limitations of it, what is REST and what isn't REST, there's a great URL here, restfulapi.net. That's a great start. And it has links off to all kinds of other things, but Google is your friend. This is a great place. So now a very brief history on REST, Apex, and ORDS. So Apex-based REST services first were introduced in Apex 4.2. And this stored its definitions in the Apex metadata repository, just like everything else, just like your pages and regions and whatnot. And this remained the way to create REST services in Apex through version 5.1. Now, it may have used Apex Listener or ORDS under the cover to expose those REST services or to serve those REST services, but the definitions were done via an Apex screen, and the metadata was stored in the Apex metadata services tables. ORDS first introduced REST services in 2.0, and it also tried to piggyback on the same definition tables that Apex used. So it originally stored its metadata in those same tables. But because people started wanting to use ORDS separately from Apex, in version 3 of ORDS, they introduced the ORDS metadata repository and kind of split off from that. So for a while, there were two ways that you could define REST services, the Apex way and the ORDS way. Still served together by ORDS, but there were two definitions, two places where definitions may have been stored. As of Apex 18.1, the Apex-based RESTful services have been deprecated, and therefore ORDS metadata, or the ORDS central repository, is the single repository of record moving forward. So therefore, you should migrate all your Apex-based REST services to ORDS. You should develop any new services using ORDS, and in the future, it's very possible that the Apex RESTful Services console to define REST services will be removed completely. Right now, from 18.1, it's read-only. But further on down the line, it may be removed completely from there. So you can't even look at your old REST services. A little bit about ORDS. It's a fully supported feature of the Oracle database. If you have a license for the database, it covers ORDS. And technically, ORDS is all you need to expose REST services. You don't have to use Apex. Apex is the definition screens in Apex are basically a thin veneer over the top of the ORDS APIs, and I'll show you that as we go walk through these. So ORDS provides a set of PL SQL APIs to manage the REST endpoints, to define REST service modules and handlers, to define the security, and actually to automatically REST enable certain database objects. The ORDS metadata repository views, which allow you to see into the ORDS metadata, basically gives you full access to what services you have defined, how they're protected, and so on. In terms of Apex, it is also a fully supported feature of the Oracle database. From 18.1 and forward, we now provide a GUI on top of the ORDS APIs. You can no longer create your Apex-based RESTful services. You can only read them. You can migrate them over to ORDS, but no more creation of Apex-based services. Now you create the ORDS-based REST services in the ORDS RESTful workshop. Again, you can create and manage the RESTful services, the privileges, and the roles. And we did our best to try to mirror what it looks like in SQL Developer. So now on to exposing REST, becoming RESTful, a very, very high level overview of what ORDS provides in terms of APIs and how that actually works. When you talk about REST services from ORDS, there are two ways that you can enable items for REST. You can do it with what's called auto REST, or you can do it manually. And there's benefits and downsides to each one. So let's talk about auto REST. This is the concept of basically making a database resource available via ORDS with zero code. You basically just say, I want to enable table depth, and it creates a whole API on top of it in REST that allows you to expose that table externally. You can expose tables, views, packages, procedures, and functions. Those are the types of database objects that are exposable through auto REST. Now, if you're a purist, you'll say that the packages, procedures, and functions are not actually REST endpoints. They are remote procedure calls, and you'd be right. Basically, it's a HTTP way to go and execute those procedures and get back some information. With AutoRest, you sacrifice flexibility and customizability for the ease of its creation. There's no way to customize the individual columns that are included or the data format of the JSON. You get what you get. And there's no way to introduce extra validation logic. For instance, if you want to validate something before someone deletes anything, not possible with AutoRest. It's just what ORDS gives you. Manual REST service creation, on the other hand, requires you to specify the SQL or PL SQL that supports whatever actions are required, whether that's an insert, an update, a delete, a select, whatever. It's definitely more effort, but you have full control and full flexibility. You can customize the columns, you can join across multiple tables, you can validate incoming PL SQL or incoming data with PL SQL, you can include complex logic. Basically, that's it. So you choose your way, AutoRest or manual. Anything complex, I'd suggest you go with the manual side. If you're just wanting to expose a little bit of data, select only, then do it through a view with AutoRest. But in both cases, AutoRest or manual, the first thing that has to happen is you have to ORDS enable your schema. And what this does is it registers your schema with ORDS to say, hey, this schema is allowed and ready to expose REST services. Unless your schema is enabled or registered with ORDS, you won't be able to serve REST services out of it. Now, when you start to talk about REST services, the very first thing you come up against is a bunch of buzzwords, right? A bunch of nomenclature that you need to know. And here's a very brief example or description of what those are. You see the URL down below. The server is self-explanatory. That's the server that is exposing the web service. Then you get down to the next thing, which is the ORDS alias. This is the alias for the ORDS engine itself, the ords.war file that gets deployed. And often this is defined at the web server level. You can call it whatever you want. You've probably seen it called ORDS or PLS/Apex or something along those lines. But that's set up at the ORDS or the web server level. Everything below that, the schema alias, the module, the template, and the handler, these are all set up within the definition of ORDS itself. So the schema alias, when you enable a schema, you basically say, what do I want it to appear like on the URL? And for security purposes, you want to make sure that you're not exposing your base schema name. The module is the base path for a group of related services. Template defines the path that is used for access of a specific resource. And then underneath that specific resource, you have the handlers, whether you're going to get, post, put, or delete, insert, update, delete, or select, right? And so you can kind of think of it from that aspect. As we go through and talk about each one of these things, this is how it relates to how you're going to call it on the command line. Some things to note. When you expose a schema via REST, you get some things for free. These URLs are available to help you understand what is available in your schema or help external people, consumers, understand what's available in your schema and exposed as REST. And these are available, one, if you have a specific privilege, if security is turned on and you have the right privilege, or if that security is turned off. By default, that security is probably turned off. So these URLs, you can get information about all services in your schema by going to the metadata catalog or the Open API, or you can get information about a specific service by simply appending the service name or the module name on the end of that. I'll show you that in a little bit, but this information is really useful. One of the things that I would suggest is the original metadata catalog is kind of old school stuff. The Open API catalog should be preferred. This is much more complex and a much more robust description of what is available. It also gives you information about the methods that are available for each service. And you can pump that through a Swagger interpreter and actually get full Swagger documentation if you want to. So from ORDS aspect, let's look at what APIs are out there, just at a very top level. So the enable schema, or the schema level stuff, and allows you to enable, disable, set the alias for and completely deregister your schema. So the enable schema allows you to enable or disable. You basically say enable true or enable false. Drop schema or drop rest for schema basically deregisters your schema from orgs. Now you got to be careful with this one because it also deletes all of the current rest definitions. So it will completely deregister and completely out. It's like dropping a schema from the database. Everything rest related will be dropped. To enable an object specifically, we have an API for that. The next two, define service and the define module and template and handlers or whatnot are there's a shorthand and a longhand for this, and I'll show you this a little bit later, but basically this is what allows you to manually define the services. So you define the module and then the template handler and any parameters you want. Then for security, you have creating roles, deleting roles, renaming roles, and then defining privileges, renaming them, and deleting privileges. And we'll talk about how all those relate to security here in a little bit. So the first thing that we need to do is enable a schema for orgs before we can do anything else. So let's look at the API to do that. Basically, we say orgs.enable schema. We give it whether it's enable or not, you give it a true or false. You give it a schema name, you give it a mapping type, and base path is what you use 99% of the time. The URL mapping pattern, this is the alias of, this is what's going to appear in the URL. And then whether or not you set auto rest off on. Now, a note about that auto rest off. This does not mean authorization on to access the resource. This is only authorization to access the metadata about a resource. That fools a lot of people, so be careful about that one. So what this does is it makes orgs aware that the schema exists and that it may have 0 to many resources exposed. And you only need to do it once per schema. You really don't need to do it every time you define a new resource. It really just is something that you do once. In Apex, basically we have a screen for that. You go to the SQL Workshop and go to the RESTful Services in the orgs RESTful Workshop, and there's a button that you press, Register Schema with orgs, and it pops up an orgs schema attributes dialog. And in that dialog, you're asked some questions that directly relate to the underlying API. You're choosing your schema in the upper right. You're saying whether you want it enabled or disabled. You're telling it what you want the alias to be, and you're telling it whether you want the metadata access to be turned on or off. So it's pretty simple. What's it said? Just a veneer over across the top. So very quickly, what we're going to do is we're going to go and look at that. I have running on my laptop a little VM that has Apex 19 and orgs 19 installed on it. So I'm going to go to SQL Workshop, go to RESTful Services. Now I have some old Apex-based REST services installed. So it's giving me the choice of going to view and migrate my old ones or go to orgs. I'm just going to go to the org side, and you'll see here that nothing is turned on. It basically says the schema is not registered with orgs. To do this, I just click my button. I tell it that I want to enable it. I'm going to call it, my schema is called Doug. I'm going to obfuscate it slightly by calling it Douglas. I'm not going to install the sample service, but if you want to install the sample service, it's basically just an HR service on top of emp and dept. I'm not going to do this time, and I'm going to keep the authorization for the metadata off. So by doing this, I just click, and all of a sudden I have the RESTful Services console. Quickly, we'll walk through this. I can see the version of orgs that I'm running. I can also see that I've got a node here that I can go and see what enabled objects. This is enabled database objects with auto rest, the modules that I may have created myself, and then the privileges and roles that I may have created there. Gives you a dashboard. You can see that access is enabled. Authorization for the metadata catalog is turned off, so it's giving me a little warning here. Hey, there's no authorization for the metadata catalog. You may want to turn that on. But I do have my schema aliased, so it's saying, yeah, I'm kind of safe there. Okay, so now that we have that turned on, we're ready to go and do some REST stuff. The first thing that we want to talk about is the auto rest. To do this with the command line or with the API, basically it's a simple call. You say orgs.enableObject, tell it whether it's enabled or disabled, tell it the schema, tell it the object that you want to enable and the object type, give it an alias, and once again, tell it whether or not you want to hide or show the metadata about this. Now, one thing I forgot to mention on the one above is when you are providing the schema, only a DBA or a user with DBA privileges can enable or disable schemas other than their own. Otherwise, you're always enabling or disabling things in your own schema. Excuse me. So what this does is it makes this object available via REST. And what does that mean? Well, making it available via REST may mean a couple different things based on the type, and we'll get to that in a couple seconds. In Apex, you can do the same thing. In Apex 19.1 and above, we've added a new tab to the SQL Workshop, the REST tab. So when you select an object in the SQL Workshop, you see this new REST tab over here, and it allows you to define whether or not that is REST enabled. Again, it matches exactly what's going on underneath the covers. You've got your schema in the upper right, you've got whether it's enabled, you've got the object alias, you've got whether or not the metadata is available, you've got the object type by having selected it in the left-hand pane, and you've got the object name by having selected it in its own right. So when you create that or when you run that, it enables the object. So what do you get when you auto-REST enable something? When you auto-REST a table, you actually get the full complement of everything. You get a get, a post, a put, and a delete. So you're able to actually insert, update, and delete and select everything from that table. And the challenge is that when you REST enable a table, you have no control over whether those are available or not. You REST enable the table, so you get all the stuff. You can't just say, hey, I only want get on this. If you want that, you have to do it manually. With a view, you only are provided a get method. That's because the view is non-updatable. Even if you have something like an instead of trigger, Orge doesn't know that you have that, so it's only providing you a get method. With procedures, functions, and packages, you get a post, which is basically executing the procedure. You can do things with procedures like pass back a ref cursor to Orge, and Orge will turn the data from that ref cursor into JSON and pass it back to the caller. So let's do a quick auto-REST demo. What I want to do now is I want to go to SQL Workshop and go to the object browser. I've only got two little tables here. I've got my emp and depth, but I'm going to go to depth this time, and I'm going to go to the REST tab. And right now it's not enabled. I'm going to click yes, enable it. I'm going to keep the aliases depth because it's on my little play device. I'm not going to require authorization for the metadata catalog. If I did, this is the role that a user would need to be able to get to the metadata catalog. So you'd have to actually grant the user, any user that, that was accessing this, a specific role, and it's a role related to the schema and the underlying object name. If I apply this now, when it comes back, it gives me a URL. If I take this URL and open a new tab here, paste it in, I immediately see that I'm getting JSON with my departments in it. Now, you can do more than just select, but to do that, you can't really do that very easily from a web browser. So to do that, I'm going to use something called Postman. And this is basically a free little tool that you can get that allows you to test and develop with web services. And what I've got here is I've got my get from depth. And so basically it's saying here I've got a get, I've got my URL, and I don't have anything else defined here. I'm just saying go and run a get on this URL, and if I send it, it'll bring back the data. And we can see that we have 4 departments, 10, 20, 30, 40. The neat thing about this is that with Orge, it automatically provides the ability to get a specific department simply by appending the ID, the primary key, on the end of it. So here, if I say I want to go and get department 10 and send it, it's only going to bring back the data for department 10. In this case, the next thing we want to do is to do an insert. I want to create a new department. To do this, an insert is related to a post in terms of HTTP. So I basically say I want to post to this URL, and I want to provide what the data is. So to do that, I provide the data based on a JSON document in the body of the call. And the items that I include in here are related directly to the column names of the table: department number, department name, and location. So if I go ahead and post this now, you can come back and see that it says 201 created, and it passes me back the record to say, hey, things were created in exactly the way that you told me to. And, oh, if you wanted to go see it, here's where you could go see it. And if you wanted to get some metadata about it, this is where you could go get some metadata about it. Okay, well, let's say that I got this wrong, and I'm in Fort Worth, and I want this to be a Fort Worth. So if I go and try to update this, updates are a put. So a put to that same location, but giving it 99 for the ID, and I'm going to say I want the location to be Fort Worth. If I say the location is Fort Worth, that's really the only thing I want to change, right? So that's the only thing I need to push across. If I send, something went wrong because now my department name is null. This is a problem or a feature, an undocumented feature about the way that the ORDS APIs work. When you update using the ORDS APIs, the ones that they give you with AutoRest, you have to pass across all of the things in the record, including the things that you have not changed. So what you would have to do is you'd have to query the record, change the things that you want to change, and push back the entire record to do that. So to do that here with the body, if I wanted to change the just this to Fort Worth, I'd have to push back technology and Fort Worth. You don't have to push back the primary key because that's been being pushed across on the URL. If I send it now, I can see that, oh, good, it got everything back the way that I want it to. And I can go query that over here, and it would give me back just that number. If I wanted to delete, once again, you've got a delete option, the delete method. You say, I want to delete number 99, send it, and it shows back that you've got one row deleted. So it's nice that it gives you that for free, but there are some downsides to that, right? The other thing that's interesting about this is that if you were to go and try to update a record that does not exist, I've deleted number 99 now, right? If I go and say I want to update a record that does not exist and send it, I would expect it to tell me, hey, the record doesn't exist. It doesn't. It says, okay, I didn't find it, so I created it for you. Aren't I friendly and nice? That's something to watch out for too. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and delete that so that gets out of there. So this is AutoRest in a nutshell, basically kind of what it gives you, and it's a very high level. I didn't do any packages, procedures, and functions. That's a little bit more in depth, but there's some really good documentation, some good blog posts out there for that kind of stuff. So you've seen AutoRest and what it can do and some of the limitations. Let's talk about manual creation of web services. So service creation example using the APIs. Now, there's two here. There's the shorthand and the longhand. Remember I told you about define service and then the longhand version of defining the individual pieces. Define service basically allows you to create a module, a template, and a handler all in one call. The challenge is that it only allows you to create one handler. If you need to create other handlers on top of that, then you'd have to revert back to executing the defined handler pieces. I personally prefer to use the longhand simply because I know that way I'm getting exactly what I want and I can create multiple, and you have a little bit more control over it that way. And plus, you can have a little bit more granular control on some of this stuff. But with this doing the create and this doing the create, they equate to exactly the same thing. You'll end up with the same service in the end. Doing this in Apex, we have screens for that. You go to the module and say create module, and it equates basically to the orgs.define module, right? You've got the module name, the base path, the status, the items per page, the comments, the same way that you would before. Once you've created a module, then you can create templates underneath it. At that point, it's the same as creating the define template call. P module name, the pattern that you're going to use to call it, the priority, how you're going to protect it with an e-tag, or how you're going to deal with caching, and then the comments. And then you get down to the individual handler. So you've got a get, a post, a put, delete handler. This is a get. Once again, you're referencing the module name, the pattern, the method, whether it's a get, post, put, delete, the source type, how many items per page, and this can override the items per page at the top level, the comments, and then you've got your source. So basically, like I said, it's just a veneer over the top of what Org is providing you anyway. It's just a very pretty veneer. Once that's done, once you've created that module, very much like before, when you're doing the auto rest, it's going to give you a URL that you can go and do your get, or do your put, or do your post. And when you copy that and put it in the browser, you're going to get the same kind of thing. You're going to get the employee data. So that was a quick, overview of doing the get. But what about the inserts, the updates, and the deletes? Well, for each of those actions, you need a new handler. For insert, you need a post. For update, you need a put. For delete, you need a delete. At this point, you may be thinking that it's too much effort, and you may be tempted to fall back on the auto rest. But remember, you can't control the columns that you get returned. You can't control the format of the JSON. You can't control any logic in there around inserts, updates, or deletes. So what you gain in ease of creation, you give up in control, basically. So what we're going to do now is a quick manual rest demo. And instead of making you watch me type, I'm going to go back over here. And I have created these before, and I'm going to load them up, and then we'll walk through them. So I'm going to go to the REST services, Orgs Workshop. And at this point, I've created some before and I exported them. I'm going to import them. So I'm going to go choose my file at my desktop, and I'm going to get this REST service definition and import it. Now, this is what I consider a pretty simple REST service across the top of the emp table. So if I go and look at these, what I've got as my module is I've given it a name, and we'll need this name later when we talk about security. I've given it a path. This is the path that happens after the orgs alias. So you can see here in red where that occurs. So you've got the orgs alias and the schema alias, then this thing. Whether it's published or not, the pagination size, and that's how many records get returned per batch that you call, and so on. And so at that point, you can go look at the individual methods or templates that are underneath it. When I created the next level, a template, I wanted to replicate what Orgs did when it did the auto rest. I wanted to be able to call HR/employees by itself and get all employees, but I also wanted to be able to append that employee ID at the end of it to be able to call it that same URL and get a specific employee. So what you can do is when you create a URL or create a URL template, you can add your ID, your bind variable there, and follow it with a question mark, and that says it's optional. It doesn't need to be on the URL. So, but we do need to take care of that when we're talking about all the different things like the get, the post, the deletes. We need to understand whether it's being passed or not. All right. So at this level, basically what this is doing is saying, here's the URL or the part of the URL that you're going to have to call to get to these individual handlers. So let's first go through the individual handlers. Let's go select first, which is the get. This is pretty simple. We're just going to select all things from emp. But because we have this optional item on the end, we want to basically say, I want to get the items from emp where the employee number is equal to the ID that was passed, or the ID is null. If the ID is null, we get everything. If we send in an ID, we only get the thing that we chose. All right, so there's the select. Let's do an insert. That's the post. Once again, it's under the same the same template, but the code is a little different. So what I'm doing here is I am doing insert into the employees table, and I'm using bind variables here in the insert. Now these bind variables will come across as part of the JSON that I send as my request. ORDS is really smart, and it says, okay, for each element in JSON that I find, I'm going to create a bind variable you can use in your select statement or in your SQL, and that bind variable will hold the value of whatever it was in the JSON. And now what I'm doing here is I'm saying that if my insert works, everything works, I'm going to create a status. I'm going to assign a status of 201. Now this is an HTTP status that designates that something was created. And we can talk about HTTP statuses. There's bunches of them. There's good web references on them. The 201 defines basically that the resource created something in the back end. If anything goes wrong, I'm basically going to put the status to 400, which is the HTTP error status, and I'm going to set the value of this bind variable error message equal to whatever the SQL error message is. Below my source, I have defined two parameters that these are that are being used up here. So this XApex status code, this name here is what ORDS uses to pass back the status. The error message is just one that I made up. This one is something that you need to know. This is how to pass back a status with ORDS. The error message is one that I just made up, but it's going to be passed back as part of the header as well. This name is what ORDS sends back to the user. This name internally is the bind variable I use to assign values. The direction is out. It's going to be passed on the HTTP header, and they're both strings. So at this point, when something happens, it's either going to succeed or it's going to fail. And I'm going to if it fails, I'm going to pass back the SQL error message. We'll look at that just a little bit later. Okay, we've got the insert. Let's do the update. The update is a little bit different. I didn't want to have the same problem that ORDS Autorest has in terms of updating the underlying record, but wiping out everything else. So what I did instead is, if they passed across an ID, basically if they're trying to update a specific record, then I go and I get the record that they're trying to update. Then I update that record, and I basically say I want to set the value either to the name that got passed across, or to the value that got passed across in my JSON, or if that's null or missing, then pass across or use the existing value. So I'm just using a simple NVL and using the record from my cursor to say, okay, if they didn't pass it across, then they didn't want to change it, so just use it. When I finish my loop, I check to see if I updated any records. If I did, then my 200 status says, yep, success. Otherwise, if I did not find any records, if I didn't update anything, that value that they passed across for an update didn't exist. So I'm going to pass back an error message of employee not found with an error code. Unlike the Autorest that just says, oh, well, I didn't find anything to update, so I inserted it. Wasn't I a nice guy? I don't want that. If they ended up passing across a null for the ID, you can't update something you don't know what is. So basically, I'm passing across a 400 code, basically saying that the employee number has to be specified on a put. Anything else that happens, I'm just passing back the error code. With a delete, it's a little more simple. A delete is basically a delete, right? We only want to delete if they've given us an ID to delete. So if the ID is not null, then we delete. If we are able to delete it, and we basically deleted one record, or we deleted some records, then we basically say, yep, we succeeded. Otherwise, we didn't find the employee. And again, if they didn't pass anything across, then the employee number has to be specified, and we've got our error catch-all down here. Once again, on the post, the put, and the delete, we're specifying these parameters to be able to pass stuff back. Now let's go to Postman and try this out. So here's our manual REST. First thing I'm going to do is I've got my manual. I've got my HR, Douglas HR employees. That's my, my REST endpoint. I'm going to do a get, and here are all my employees. You can see that it ends with 7934. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to use that. I'm going to get a single employee, 7369. And I know that one exists because it was in here. So 7369, I'm going to get a single employee. It'll pass it back. If I try to get an employee that doesn't exist, it's going to pass back nothing. The employee did not exist. Okay. Now let's go and insert a new employee. With this, we use a post. This is the insert. And again, we need to pass across some JSON for all the things in the employee table. I'm going to give it the ID of 9999, so it's easy to find. It's me. I'm a janitor. Here's my manager ID. There's my hire date. My salary is 50. I get no commission, and I'm part of Department 40. So if I run this now, I can see I get the 201 created back. So I've got it actually worked. Everything's fine. If I want to go and get that employee, I can change my number here to 9999, and there I am. Let's update that employee. So I'm going to go to the body, and I really only want to update two things. I want to update my job. I got a promotion. I'm now not a janitor. I'm a custodian, and that's an extra 25 bucks a week. So let's go do that. Send. 200 created. What if I wanted to try to update someone that wasn't there? Well, I get a 400 bad request, but in my headers, I can see that the error message is there, employee not found. Or if I try to update with nothing, I can look at my headers, the employee number must be specified. All my error messages are coming back properly. All right, let's go and delete an employee. First, let's try to delete an employee that doesn't exist. Again, we get that preview, 400 bad requests, but if we look at the header, error message says employee is not found. Can't do that. If I were to go and try to delete nobody, once again, we have to say the employee number is specified, but let's just go and delete that employee 9999. I get a 200 OK, my header comes back, everything's fine. And now if I go and try to get that single employee, same thing, I get nothing back. So we've created a full REST API across the top of the emp table, and we've done it ourselves. Very similar to what we got from the auto REST, but we had more control over it, and we were able to decide what would happen in certain circumstances. Okay. We are quickly running out of time here, so I got to speed up. There's a bunch of information out there on creating REST services, a bunch of blogs, Jeff Smith's blog, the Oracle Learning Library, Tim Hall, documentation, Google. Google's your friend with all this stuff. So let's talk about securing REST services. I want to get through this as quickly as possible. So I may speed through some of this stuff so I can get to some of the demos. There's a lot of moving parts in this, obviously. There's the module that you want to secure, but then there's a role, a privilege, and the client itself. All these pieces have to work together to come together to create the security on a module. One thing to note, that a module can only be associated with a single privilege, and it really isn't very obvious of that. So when you assign a module to a privilege, and then you go and assign it to a different privilege. It doesn't warn you. Orange doesn't warn you at the base that it's going to another privilege. It basically assigns it to the new privilege and removes it from the old one. There's work to be done on the UIs for that, and I think that there should be some warning on that, but that's something that we can do in the future. So authentication comes in multiple flavors. You got first party and OAuth 2. First party is basically known as basic auth. It's username and password combo. You pass the username and password across, and as long as the username and password are fine, then you're good. ORDS 18.1 supports basic auth using both database users and Apex Workspace users, and that's pretty easy to set up. The problem with that is it's kind of insecure. It's not something you want to use in a very secure environment. OAuth 2 is more what you'd want to use, and there's two flavors of OAuth 2, or two major flavors of OAuth 2. There's two-legged, which is also called client credentials, and there's three-legged. The two-legged, basically only the owner of the service and the client, the consumer, are involved in the transaction, and that's what mostly happens. Client credentials flow is almost always what you're going to get with that. The three-legged or third party is a three-legged flow. It involves three people. It involves the provider, consumer, and some kind of controller and some manual intervention. And because of that manual intervention, that need for that manual intervention, it's not used that often except in very secure circumstances. So let's talk about basic auth with database credentials. This actually requires you to change the definition or the configuration of ORDS. You've got to add the JDBC auth enabled flag to the default XML file, and you have to remove another flag from there. And you'd obviously have to bounce and set everything up. Because this is a base level change and it's either on or off for everything, it's something that you really need to think hard about. It's not necessarily advisable for security reasons that we talked about. OAuth 2 is definitely better, but it's possible. So the steps to create a database, to use database credentials there, you basically create a database user, let's call it Zeus. You create user, and then you grant session to that user. Then you'd create a database role, call it ORDS REST role 1, and you grant that role to Zeus. Now that role doesn't have to hold any privileges at all. It's just a role. What happens is when you create an ORDS role that exactly matches that database role, ORDS says, oh, this user has that database role that matches the role, the ORDS role that's protecting the resource. I'll let him through. Everything's good. So the protected service is okay. He'll be able to use that service. So there's a match there, and it has to match exactly in terms of, you know, the value or the name of that role. Apex credentials work very much the same, the Apex user credentials. There's no specific change required at the ORDS level, though. So this can be used even if you don't make those changes at ORDS. You go create your Apex user. You create an Apex user group. Let's call it Apex REST Group 1 or something like that, and you assign that Apex user to the group. Then when you go and create the ORDS role, again, it has to match exactly to the Apex user group. If that user passes its username and password across on a basic auth, ORDS will say, hey, does this user have this ORDS group, and is it assigned, or sorry, this ORDS role, and is it assigned to a group inside of Apex that matches this ORDS role? Sweet, that person can be walked through. When you're using an ORDS role and basic auth, basically you need to be very careful. If ORDS roles match a database role or an Apex user group, any user assigned to that role will have access to that service. For database credentials, it's only true if that DB-auth switch has been flipped in ORDS, but for Apex, it's always true. This is why it's unadvisable to use basic auth when you need tight security, because you could very easily accidentally let someone in without knowing. Tim St. Hilaire just recently posted a very good blog and a video about basic auth in general. I firmly recommend that you go and watch that for more details on this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go and create a very quick user and show you that we can do this. So let me get back over here. to Apex. Oh, that's the wrong one. Come back to Apex. So now I'm going to go over to my users. I have a user called Milo. I have created him as an unprivileged user. He's not an admin. He's not a developer. He doesn't even have team development access. I also created a group called Apex REST 1, and I assigned Milo to that group, right? So once that's done, I've got the user, I've got the group. I can now go over to orgs, to my RESTful workshop, go to orgs, and what I need to do now is I need to create a role, and I'm going to go create a role called Apex REST 1. And the role is just a name. It's just a thing. It doesn't really hold any details. It's just a name. So I've created the role. Here's the kicker. You got to go create the privilege. And when you create a privilege, this is where you link. I'm going to create this called HR Priv. And it's just an HR Priv. Here, I'm going to say, I'm going to assign this role to the priv, and I am going to protect this module. This is where it links it all together. So once this is in place, because this role matches the user group that I created for Milo, and that Milo user has that group and therefore inherits this role, I create the privilege. And now Milo will be able to run this, this privileged or this protected resource. So if I go over to my Postman again and open this up, if I were to try, now that this privilege is protected, or sorry, this resource is protected, if I try to just go against it with no authorization whatsoever, my authorization is none, right? If I try to go and get all employees now, I'm going to get 401 unauthorized. This is basically saying you don't have any authorization for this. If I try to do it using Milo with my authorization, basic auth, passing across the name and password, username and password, because he has the right privileges in the background, I get the data. Okay. All right. So that's basic auth. We are running out of time here, so once again, I'm going to try to go fast. We may go a little bit over. I hope you guys don't mind staying just a little late. All right, two-legged auth for OAuth. This is the one that we're going to go over. And as the name suggests, there are two sides to this story. We got the server side and the client side. So first, let's talk about the server side. You got some orgs OAuth APIs for this. You need to create, when you're the owner of the resource, you need to create a client for each individual person or each individual system that's going to access your stuff. This is kind of how you keep people separate. These are the APIs that you use to do that. And during the creation of that is when you assign the privilege that that user has. The privilege, as well as the role, needs to be assigned to a client. This is for OAuth specifically. So then you are able to assign or revoke a role. And then there's a set of views that you can go and look at to see the clients that you've created, what the roles they have, and what privileges they've been assigned. There's currently no UI on top of this anywhere. This is all command line, not even in SQL Developer. This is something that is scheduled for something that we're going to do inside the Orgs REST workshop in Apex. I understand that they're looking at doing it inside of SQL Dev and in SQL Dev Web as well. We're going to get with them and make sure that we all do it kind of the same way. So to create a client, we use an API. Basically, we create the client. You give it kind of a random name. The client credential here, or sorry, the grant type is a client credential. And you can give it a description, a support email, but the privilege name, is something that you have had to create before at a privilege level in Apex, or sorry, in Orgs. We created this using the Apex screens, HR Priv. We're just going to use that again. Same thing with the role. We created Apex REST 1 as the role. We're going to reuse that same role and grant that to the same user. When we do that, then we can go and look at the user itself. We've created the client. We've got it called My Client. It's a client credential flow, and it creates for us this client ID and client secret. This is kind of like a username and password, but you can't just use that to log in. You have to use that to get a time-limited token that you then pull back and you push to access the resource. So these are the two things that we would need as the client. You create the client as the owner of the resource. You give those two things to the client so that they know how to access your resource. And so the next thing to do is on the client side, you need to call using those two things, the client ID and the client secret. And in this case, I'm using a curl statement, but it could be PL SQL curl, and I'll show you in Postman how that's done. And you're passing across the client credentials type, and you're calling a specific URL to get the token. And with ORDS, basically it's your server, your ORDS alias, your schema alias, and then OAuth token. That's where you go to get it. It passes you back an access token. It tells you the token type, and it tells you how long it is before that token will expire, and you'll need another token. So that's what we need to go and use to do the call. Then we go and do the call. We pass across a header variable called authorization of type bearer, and here's the token. Then we can get the data. So quickly, what we can do is, in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I did earlier. If I go over to here, to my SQL workshop and my SQL commands, I'm going to run this SQL, which is basically the same as it was in the slides. I'm going to create a client and assign that client the privilege and the role. Done. Now, when I go and look at that client in the view, I can see that I now have a client secret and a client ID. So client ID and client secret. Now, I need these to go to Postman and run the get. So here, I need to go to my authorization. You can see here I'm using OAuth 2. I need to get a new access token. So I'm going to name the access token this. This is just a random name. Here's the token URL that I need to go to. Here's my client ID that I need to paste in. I need to make sure that I don't have any weird spaces at the end of it. I also need to go back and get my client secret and paste that in. At that point, I can go and request a token. What that's going to do, it's going to go to this URL, pass across the client ID and client secret, and it's going to say, do I get a token? Yes, I have a new token. So now I can use that token for 36,000 seconds, and I can send, and now I can get that. So now I have an OAuth 2 protected resource. All right, we're in the home stretch, only like 4 slides left. There's OAuth 2. Now, how do we do this with PL SQL? Calling database with PL SQL, you've got a lot of things to think about. Remember, earlier I said something about calling from out of the database. You need to make sure you've got your ACLs done, and if you're using HTTPS, you've got to have certificates done. So the calling database user has to have the correct ACL in place. And if you're using the Apex Web Service, the ACL has to be in place properly for Apex itself. If you're using HTTPS, you got to have an Oracle wallet to hold the certificates. You got to have all that signed stuff pushed up into the Oracle wallet. You're likely going to need the DBA's help for that because it's not a straightforward process necessarily. Here's an example PL SQL using basic auth. You create or replace a procedure with this. You basically what it is it's using the Apex Web Service make REST request. You give it the URL, you give it the method that you're going to do, and you're basically saying, I want to use the basic auth scheme. Here's the username and password. It's going to return the value into that CLOB, and what this basically does is it dumps that data to the command line or out to HTTP.p. For OAuth 2, it's more complicated. First, you have to, just like we did with Postman, you have to authenticate, right? So you have to pass across your client ID and client secret to get a token. So you're using the Apex Web Service OAuth Authenticate. Once that's done, it's going to have that bearer token in the Apex Web Service GOAuth token piece. So then you can say, I need to set up a header ID of authorization type, and I need to have the value of that be the word bearer and then the token. Then you can call the service with Apex make REST request, give it the URL and the method, and then you can get it. So it's two more steps than it was before. I do have a demo of doing exactly that, but it shows basically exactly these code snippets, and I'd rather have time for questions if we got it for that. And
yes, we have questions.
Yes, I'm sure you've got lots of questions, and I don't want to go too far over because I know we're right at the top of the hour. So more or less, that's REST in a nutshell. We've created both auto REST and manual. We've secured it with both basic and OAuth, and we've consumed it with PL SQL. All promises met, right?
Excellent, Doug. So I've got a number of questions here. The first one's actually one of mine. Is there a performance difference between auto REST and manual handlers?
Yes. So I will give a qualified yes on this. Because you do not control the code that is executed when an auto REST handler is done, there is very little opportunity to tune it. So yes, there is potentially a hit. I will also say that prior to Orange 19.1, there was a known issue with the speed of auto REST handlers. In 19.1 and above, they have addressed that issue and tuned, and they're much, 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 much faster. But if you want full control, not only with complexity and functionality, but also with performance, write them yourself.
Okay. So my next question is from Sven, and he was asking about the patch handler. So you mentioned that you have to send over all the things when you're doing auto handler. Can you do a patch handler instead?
So patch is not supported by Orange at the moment, and it is not on the timeline. And if you would like a long dissertation about why that is, Calm DeVilly's blog, I believe, has a write-up on the patch handler, the problems associated with the patch handler, and why they have not implemented it yet.
Perfect. So my next question is from Ian, and where you had that module with ID and a question mark, he's seen it where you have the curly bracket ID curly bracket, and wants to know if there's a difference between using the two of them.
So yes, the curly braces are considered old school and are officially deprecated in orgs. The colon syntax is more widely used across a breadth of REST services, is definitely preferred, and there's again, Colm has a very large write-up on his blog about that style of syntax, why it's better, and there's I even think that there's a white paper out there on the things that you can do with the colon syntax that you cannot ever do with the curly braces syntax. That means that you have more flexibility.
Excellent. Next question is from Amir, and he wants to know if you're inserting a record, can you do a returning into?
Yes, you can. So one of the things that so it would be there's one or two different ways that you can do it. You can take the insert returning into a local variable, and you can either create a header variable like I did before. Let me flip over real quick and go to the definition of the RESTful services here. Uh-oh. And it just froze. Anyway, I'll keep talking.
Not so quickly.
Yeah, I'll not so quickly do that. So you can either create a header variable and pass the value back in the header variable, or you can use http.p and print JSON and pass that value back in the body of the response. So either way, and it kind of yeah, for some reason this has gone belly up. You can do it either way. There's no right way to do it. Some people prefer to pass back stuff like that in the body and only to pass back things that would be errors or status codes in the headers. It's a matter of choice and religion, I believe. So.
Okay. Is there any sort of write-up or blog on that?
So actually, some of the examples there are some external blogs on that. That if you look, goodness. So let's just try to see if that will come back. There we go. Now it's working. I don't have any, and I don't know necessarily that there's anything that I could point to, but I know I have seen blogs that have that out there.
Okay. All good.
Yeah.
So my next question is from Kevin, and he was asking about when the commits happen. So I assume it's an implicit commit, but could you just talk to that briefly?
Yeah. So ORDS, like Apex, uses a connection pool, and it grabs an item off the pool or a connection off the pool, does your stuff, and as it returns the connection back to the pool, it does the commit and the sweep up and the cleanup and moves that back. So it's basically right before it hands that. The way I understand it is right before it hands that connection back to the pool.
Excellent. And another question here from Kevin is, can you support or will there be support for GraphQL?
I know that is a question that has been asked before of the ORDS team, and I am trying to remember what the answer to that was. I don't know is the only answer I can give you. I know it's been discussed, and as far as I know, it is not on the immediate roadmap, but I know that question has been asked before. So sorry, I don't know the direct answer to that.
Okay. So what is the difference performance between an Apex web service make REST request and an Apex execute web source? When I want to revoke the web services coming from Omo.
No, I don't know that I've tried those in comparison. So
TBD.
Yeah, TBD. That'd be a good little test to do, I guess, wouldn't it?
Hey, it would. Okay, so that's the majority of the questions I have for you. Great. So thank you very much, Doug, for a very informative session. And for all of you people out there, please sign up to Apex Office Hours, and that way you'll be notified of when our next office hours is being conducted. So thank you everyone for joining, and with that, we'll turn off the recording.